A black pilot had just completed a long-haul flight, ready to grab a coffee and rest before his next assignment. But when he stepped into the airport lounge, everything changed. A gate agent, seeing his uniform but not his rank, assumed he was in the wrong place. The confrontation escalated, whispers turned into stares, and within minutes, security was called. What happened next shocked everyone. And within just 7 minutes, the very people who tried to humiliate him found themselves facing consequences they never saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary day at the airport, until it wasn't. Miles Carter had spent his whole life stepping into rooms where he was never truly invited. He walked through the corridors of Chicago O'Hare, his captain's uniform pristine, the 4 gold stripes on his sleeve marking the years he had fought for his place in the sky. The airport hummed with movement. Pilots in their crisp uniforms, flight attendants adjusting their scarves, the sound of rolling luggage on polished tile. It was supposed to be a milestone. His first official flight as captain with Horizon Air. But some doors don't swing open so easily. Some doors stay cracked just wide enough to let you see inside, but never enough to let you through. Miles reached the crew briefing room and pushed the door open. The air inside changed the moment he stepped in. Captain Edward Whitman sat at the long table, his salt and pepper hair combed back, his hands clasped over the flight plan. Next to him, Thomas Reynolds, the regional operations director, checked his watch, his expression unreadable. Around them, other crew members shuffled papers, adjusted their ties, pretending, for just a moment, that they hadn't seen him enter. Miles set his flight bag down, nodding toward them. "Good morning, gentlemen." Reynolds didn't look up. Instead, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Captain Carter, would you mind waiting outside for a moment?" Silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. Miles didn't move. "I believe I'm assigned to this flight." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, finally looking at him. "There's been a reassignment. On what grounds?" Whitman leaned back in his chair, his lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's nothing personal, Carter. We just need someone with a little more experience with our procedures." The words hung between them like the stale air in an old house. Experience? Miles and more flight hours than half the pilots in this room. He had spent years in the Air Force, landing aircraft in combat zones where the sky itself was on fire. He had memorized every runway, every emergency protocol, every inch of this airline's procedures. But that wasn't the kind of experience they were talking about. Was it? Miles saw it in the way the younger pilots stared at the table, in the way the flight attendants shifted uncomfortably. They had seen this before. Maybe not with him, but with others. Whitman stood, adjusting his uniform. "I'm sure you don't mind." And that was the thing, wasn't it? People like Whitman never asked. They decided, and they assumed Miles would accept it because men like him had been conditioned to swallow their pride for the sake of keeping the peace. Miles clenched his jaw. Then, slowly, he reached for his flight bag, adjusted his cap, turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he looked Whitman in the eye. "Safe flight," he said. The door clicked shut behind him. And that was when Miles made a decision. They thought they could make him disappear with a polite dismissal. They were wrong. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Miles Carter stood outside the briefing room. The door shut behind him, and felt the weight of the moment settle in his bones. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger was immediate. A spark. This was something else. Something colder. Because he had seen this before. The way power disguised itself in professionalism. The way it operated in the language of reassignment, of experience, of decisions made for the best. A younger man might have stormed back into that room, demanded an explanation, forced the issue, but Miles knew better. Confrontation wouldn't win this battle. Not yet. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled to his flight assignment. There it was, a new name beside his. Captain Edward Whitman. Miles exhaled slowly. They hadn't even bothered to hide it. Instead of piloting the flight he had been assigned weeks ago, he had been demoted to co-pilot. alongside Harry Wilson. A man who had made it clear in every possible way that he didn't believe in black pilots, black captains, black men in the sky at all. Wilson was a relic, a man who carried the past with him like a second uniform. He had been flying for decades, long enough to remember a time when the cockpit belonged to only one kind of man. Miles knew what this was. It was a lesson, a reminder that no matter how many hours he had logged, no matter how many times he had earned his stripes, there were men who would always believe he was out of place. But Miles had spent his whole life in spaces where people believed he didn't belong. And that had never stopped him before. The cockpit smelled of stale coffee and arrogance. Wilson was already seated when Miles stepped inside, fingers drumming against the console like a man who had been waiting just long enough to be annoyed. He didn't look up. Just sit down and watch, Wilson muttered, adjusting the flight controls. You might learn something. Miles took his seat beside him, keeping his face blank. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power. The pre-flight checks began. Wilson went through them methodically. His voice clipped, his instructions barely acknowledging Miles' presence. When he spoke to the flight attendants, to the control tower, his tone was different, brisk, authoritative, but toward Miles, there was nothing, as if he wasn't there at all. It wasn't the words, it was the absence of them. And that was the trick, wasn't it? Not outright rejection, just a race. Miles had seen it in boardrooms, in training programs, in flight schools where he was always the one expected to prove himself while others were simply assumed to be capable. He could feel it in the way Wilson moved, in the way the man's fingers hovered just long enough over the controls, as if waiting for Miles to mess up. But he didn't, because he knew this plane like he knew his own heartbeat. And he knew Wilson, knew his type, the kind of man who didn't need to say he didn't trust you. The kind who made it clear in every clipped sentence, every dismissive glance, every unnecessary correction. The kind who thought the sky was theirs to give. The plane took off, rising into the evening sky, leaving Chicago behind in a haze of orange light. For the first half of the flight, Wilson flew in silence, his grip steady, his posture rigid. Miles said nothing. Then, as they approached Denver, something shifted. Wilson adjusted the frequency for air traffic control, then paused. Miles glanced at the screen. Wrong frequency. A simple mistake, but one that could cost them their landing instructions. Miles kept his voice even. Captain, control frequency is 128.35. Wilson's jaw tightened. A beat of silence. Then, without a word, Wilson corrected it. And just like that, the balance had shifted. Because now, for the first time, Wilson knew what Miles had known all along. That he wasn't perfect. That Miles had caught his mistake. That Miles had been watching. The rest of the descent was quiet. Too quiet. Because Wilson had made a mistake. And he knew it. The plane landed smoothly, taxiing to the gate. As soon as the engines cut off, Wilson unbuckled his seatbelt, turning to face Miles for the first time since they left the ground. Not bad, he muttered. Then, after a pause, his voice lowered, tighter. But you'll never be a real captain at Horizon. Miles smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who knew something the other didn't. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, and picked up his flight bag. You're right about one thing, Miles said, adjusting his cap. I won't become a captain the way you want me to. Then he walked out, leaving Wilson alone in the cockpit. And this time, Wilson was the one left sitting in silence. Miles Carter walked through the airport terminal, his flight bag in one hand, his mind replaying the moment in the cockpit. Wilson's voice still echoed in his ears. You'll never be a real captain at Horizon. Not never be a captain. Never be a real captain. And wasn't that the game? It was never outright rejected. That would be too obvious. Too easy to fight. No, it was always something more insidious. Something that lived in the spaces between words. Miscommunication. Reassignment. Better fit. Miles had spent his entire career navigating these unspoken rules. And now, standing in the heart of the airport, the place where he had earned his right to lead, he felt it all closing in on him. He checked his phone. A new assignment had come through. Short-haul domestic flight. It wasn't an outright demotion. But he knew what it meant. They were testing him, seeing if he would complain, seeing if he would accept it. His next flight wasn't a coveted long-haul route. It wasn't international. It wasn't what a man with his experience deserved. It was busy work. A message buzzed in. Don't take it personally. It was from James Chen, a younger pilot he had mentored. A quiet man who had learned, like Miles, that some fights had to be fought strategically. Miles exhaled slowly. He wasn't going to storm into an office, demand explanations, let them see him as angry or difficult. He knew how the game was played. So he sent back a message. I never do. And then, he walked toward his gate. The new flight was routine. A short trip from Chicago to Atlanta. Nothing remarkable. A younger flight crew. A smaller plane. Except something was off. Miles felt it the moment he entered the cockpit. The first officer, Lucas Graham, early 30s, sharp uniform, was already seated, flipping through a manual. He didn't stand when Miles entered. Didn't acknowledge him with a nod, the way co-pilots usually did. Instead, he kept his eyes on the manual. It was a small thing. A detail. But Miles knew better than to ignore details. Afternoon, Miles said, sliding into his seat. Lucas finally looked up. Captain. The word sat stiff in his mouth. Like he wasn't used to saying it to someone like Miles. Miles nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Are you ready for pre-flight? Lucas hesitated for half a second. Then, sure thing. That half second meant everything. Miles started running the checklist. He knew how this was going to go. Lucas would follow protocol, but there would be a delay in his responses. A slight reluctance in his voice. Because this was about something more than a checklist. This was about who was sitting in the left seat. And who people believed should be there. Mid-flight, turbulence hit. Not bad. Just enough to remind everyone that the sky belonged to no one. Miles adjusted the controls, countering the sudden shift. A smooth correction. Lucas cleared his throat. We, probably could have adjusted altitude earlier. Miles turned to him, raising an eyebrow. Probably, Miles said. Or we could let the instruments do their job. Which is what we did. Lucas nodded but didn't say anything. And there it was again. That thing. That hesitation. That doubt. Not spoken. Just there. Miles had flown with co-pilots who trusted him immediately. Who worked in sync with him. Who didn't second-guess every decision he made. Lucas wasn't one of them. Because somewhere in his mind, there was a voice saying, is he really supposed to be here? Miles had heard that voice before. In flight school, when an instructor had double-checked his calculations, even though they were correct. In the military, when a commanding officer had been surprised at how well he handled high-risk landings. In Horizon Air's briefing room, when they had reassigned him without cause. The voice had never been his. But he had spent his whole life answering it. When they landed in Atlanta, Miles ran through the post-flight routine. Shutting down the engines, checking the logs. Lucas stood to leave, then hesitated. You, been with Horizon long? Miles glanced at him. Long enough. Lucas nodded slowly, as if trying to work something out in his head. Then, finally, I didn't mean anything earlier. Miles let the words sit. Because they weren't really an apology. They weren't even an admission. They were a way for Lucas to say I was wrong without actually saying it. Miles nodded once. Have a good night, First Officer. Lucas hesitated again, then finally stepped out. Miles sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, staring at the dark runway outside. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But something inside him was shifting. Because the sky had never truly been free. It had always belonged to the men who thought they owned it. But they were wrong. And Miles was going to prove it. Miles Carter had always known that the fight was never in the grand gestures. Never in the outright refusals or the shouted slurs. No. It was in the waiting. The slow erosion of dignity. One small cut at a time. It was in the reassignment. The lowered gaze of a younger pilot too afraid to speak up. It was the co-pilot who hesitated just long enough to make his doubt clear. And now, it was in silence. The kind that followed him into every briefing room, every hallway, every cockpit. Because the moment he didn't react, didn't storm into an office demanding answers, they started watching. They were waiting. Waiting to see if he would fold. Waiting to see if he would accept his place. His next assignment came with a fresh humiliation. A regional route. Smaller planes. Shorter flights. A schedule packed with flights no senior captain should have been assigned to. Miles could see the pattern forming. They wanted to make him tired. Make him resent the job. Make him walk away on his own so they could say, "See? He wasn't cut out for it after all." But they had underestimated him. Miles had spent his whole life enduring discomfort designed to push him out of spaces he had earned the right to be in. He wasn't leaving. His first officer on this flight was a younger pilot named Andrew Langston. Langston was different from Lucas Graham. Where Lucas had hesitated, Langston was overly eager, almost nervous in the way he followed protocol. As if he were compensating for something. And that, too, was familiar. Miles had seen it before in young men who knew the game. Who understood what was happening but had been trained to look away. Midway through the flight, Langston broke the silence. "I saw your name on the schedule last week. You were supposed to be on the San Francisco route, right?" Miles glanced at him. "I was." Langston shifted uncomfortably. "They didn't, give you a reason?" Miles exhaled slowly, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "You already know the reason." Langston didn't answer right away. But Miles could see the way his hands tightened on the controls. Because he did know. And that was the problem. The young ones always knew. They saw what happened, but they were taught to pretend otherwise. They were told, "It's not your fight." They were told, "If you speak up, you might be next." So they learned to stay quiet. To be grateful. To survive. The turbulence hit suddenly, sharp, unexpected. Miles felt it before the alarms sounded. A crosswind, strong enough to shake the aircraft. He adjusted instinctively, his hands steady on the controls. Hold altitude, wheel stabilize. Langston hesitated. I think we should climb a little. Get above the turbulence." Quote. "No," Miles said, his voice firm. "Ride it out." Langston swallowed but followed the command. The plane shook, dipped slightly. Then, as quickly as it had come, the turbulence passed. Miles let out a slow breath. Langston exhaled sharply, nodding. "Good call." But his voice was surprising. And that was the moment. Right there. That was the thing no one ever said out loud. The assumption, buried so deep it wasn't even conscious. Would he handle it? Did he know what he was doing? Miles had flown combat missions in sandstorms so thick he couldn't see the wingtips. He had landed aircraft on icy runways in blizzards that had grounded half the fleet. And still, they doubted. Not because of what he had done, but because of what they had been conditioned to believe about men like him. After landing, Langston hesitated again. Miles had seen that look before. The kind that said, "I want to say something, but I don't know how." Langston took a breath. I just want to say, "Captain, I respect what you're doing." Miles looked at him. "And what's that?" Langston shifted his weight, glancing around before answering. "Sticking it out." Miles let the words settle. Because that was all they ever saw. The sticking it out. The endurance. They never saw the weight. They never saw the exhaustion of proving yourself over and over. In spaces where failure wasn't an option. Where your mistakes weren't just mistakes. They were ammunition. Where your excellence wasn't a shield. It was a burden. Miles nodded. "Get some rest, Langston." And then, without another word, he walked away. Because there was still work to do. And he was far from finished. Miles Carter had learned long ago that the world was not fair. He had learned it in the sharp corrections of flight instructors who demanded more from him than from his white classmates. He had learned it in the double takes of passengers who saw him in the cockpit and hesitated. Their smiles polite but uncertain. And now, he was learning it again. In the silence that followed him wherever he went in Horizon Air. Not outright hostility. No, they had become too refined for that. It was more insidious than hatred. It was doubt. It was absence. It was the sudden shift in schedules. The reassigned flights. The unspoken expectation that he would leave on his own. That he would grow tired of fighting battles that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. But what they didn't understand was that Miles had never had the luxury of walking away. Because the sky belonged to him as much as it did to any other man who had earned it. And he was not leaving. The next flight was to Miami. Routine. A full flight. Clear skies. His co-pilot was Thomas Reeves. A man who had been with Horizon for over a decade but had never quite made captain. Miles knew the type. The kind of man who had once been comfortable. Once been assured that the world would hand him the life he had expected. Until it didn't. The kind of man who had watched younger pilots. Black pilots. Surpass him and had swallowed that bitterness down. Letting it settle into a quiet resentment. Miles had flown with men like him before. And he knew, the moment Reeves sat down beside him in the cockpit, that this flight would be different. It started small. A delay in responses. A reluctance to acknowledge commands. When Miles called for an altitude adjustment, Reeves took a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Not enough to be insubordinate. Just enough to make it known. Miles ignored it. Because this was a long game. Because they were always waiting for him to snap. Midway through the flight, turbulence hit. A sharp, unexpected drop. Miles adjusted immediately. His hands moving with the instinct of a man who had spent years trusting the plane more than he trusted the people around him. But Reeves reached for the controls. Too fast. Too aggressive. "I've got it," he muttered. Miles didn't move his hands. "No, you don't." Reeves hesitated. The moment stretched. The plane trembled slightly, then steadied. Miles kept his voice even. "This is my flight, First Officer." Reeves' jaw tightened, but he pulled his hands back. And that was the moment. Because this wasn't about turbulence. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. This was about a man like Reeves, who had spent his entire life believing that men like Miles should not be in charge. And now, here he was, in the left seat, commanding the flight, and Reeves hated it. They landed in Miami smoothly. Miles shut down the engines, ran through the final checklist, and removed his headset. Reeves sat still for a moment, staring at the controls. Then, finally, he spoke. "You know, there's a lot of talk about you." Miles didn't look at him. "Is that so?" Reeves exhaled sharply. "Yeah. Some of the guys think you're playing the long game. Trying to stir things up." Miles turned to face him. His expression unreadable. "Do they?" Reeves hesitated. And there it was. The moment where a man like him could either name the thing out loud or pretend it didn't exist. And he did what they always did. He let it go unspoken. Shook his head. "You're not gonna win this one, Carter." Miles studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had already decided the ending to this story. "We'll see," Miles said. And then, without another word, he walked out of the cockpit. Because the fight was far from over. It was just beginning. The thing about being a black man in a space that was never meant for you is that you learn very quickly the difference between silence and peace. Silence is what they offer you when they want you to go away. Peace is what you take when you refuse. Miles Carter was taking his peace, one flight at a time. But the war was escalating. Not in obvious ways. No slurs. No outright refusals. No one said, "You don't belong here, Carter." Instead, they said, "We've reassigned you." Instead, they said, "It's just protocol." Instead, they said nothing at all. And that silence? That silence was the loudest thing in the world. The next flight was to Los Angeles. A long-haul, cross-country route that should have gone to someone else. Someone with less experience. Someone with less to prove. But they had assigned it to him. Because they were watching. They wanted to see if he would break. Miles wasn't breaking. He wasn't built that way. The first sign of trouble came before he even boarded. A crew chief, Markson, an older man with tired eyes, stood near the gate, his expression unreadable. "Captain Carter." Miles nodded. "Everything set?" Markson hesitated. Then, "Too casual. There's been a maintenance issue. Minor. Shouldn't be a problem." Miles exhaled slowly. "Define minor." Markson rubbed the back of his neck. Just a glitch in the hydraulic pressure readings. We cleared it. Miles felt it then. That slow tightening in his chest. Because this wasn't just negligence. This was a test. They wanted to see if he would push back. If he would refuse to fly. If he would hesitate. Just for a second. Because a second of hesitation was all they needed to say. See? He can't handle it. Miles looked Markson in the eye. Run the check again. A beat. Markson's jaw tensed. Then, finally, he nodded. And that was all the confirmation Miles needed. The cockpit was quiet. His first officer, David Sinclair, was already in his seat, flipping through pre-flight procedures. Sinclair was young, too young to have been shaped by the old ways, but not so young that he didn't understand them. He looked up. They're making you work for this one. Miles strapped in. They always do. Sinclair hesitated. Then, carefully. Have you ever thought about leaving? Miles glanced at him. And where? Sinclair shifted. I don't know. Somewhere where you don't have to. Quote. He stopped himself. Because he knew better than to say it out loud. Somewhere where you don't have to fight for your right to exist. Miles smiled. But there was no humor in it. The sky's the same everywhere. Sinclair. And that was the truth. There was no safe space. There was only one here. And Miles was staying. They took off into a smooth night sky. The city lights fading behind them. The first 2 hours were routine. Then, just before they crossed the Rockies, the instrument panel flashed. Hydraulic pressure warning. Sinclair sat up straight. We just checked that system. Miles didn't answer immediately. He had seen things like this before. Errors that weren't errors. Tests that weren't tests. Except this wasn't a test. This was real. A flicker of pressure loss. A slight drop in hydraulic function. Nothing catastrophic. Yet. But it was enough. Enough for Miles to know that whoever had cleared that maintenance check had done so knowing damn well something wasn't right. His hands were steady on the controls. He glanced at Sinclair. Reroute to Denver. Sinclair hesitated. They're going to say, quote, they can say whatever they want. Miles said. His voice was calm. Final. Sinclair exhaled. Then nodded. Rerouting to Denver. The landing was smooth. By the time they taxied to the gate, a team of mechanics was already waiting. Sinclair unbuckled. I'll handle debriefing. Miles shook his head. No. I will. He stepped out of the cockpit, walking toward the chief mechanic. Markson was there. His face was tight. His hands shoved into his pockets. Miles stopped in front of him. Neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Miles said, you knew. Markson didn't answer. Didn't deny it. Didn't admit it. Just stood there. And that silence? That was everything. Later, in the pilot's lounge, Sinclair sat beside him, arms crossed. They're going to come after you for this. Miles smirked. They already have. Sinclair exhaled. You think they'll try to push you out? Miles leaned back. Let the question settle. Then, he smiled. They're going to try. And if they did? Well, they'd better be ready for the fight. Miles Carter knew the war was coming long before they declared it. The hydraulic failure had been the first real move. Not a mistake. Not negligence. A warning. A message. Sent in the language of men who understood how power worked. Subtle. Calculated. Deniable. But the problem with warnings is that they only work if you're afraid. And Miles wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The next day, the summons came. A meeting. Not in a briefing room. Not in the pilot's lounge. Upstairs. Executive level. Where the air smelled like money and power. And the men in suits sat in leather chairs deciding who belonged and who didn't. Miles had been here before. Not in this office. But in rooms just like it. Rooms where they spoke in clipped, measured tones. Rooms where they didn't tell you to leave. They just made it clear that you weren't welcome. The conference room was all glass and steel. High above the terminal where passengers hurried from gate to gate. Oblivious to the quiet battles waged over their safety. Thomas Reynolds was already seated. His hands folded neatly on the table. Across from him sat Richard Whitman. Miles had expected that. But the third man in the room surprised him. Harold Wilson. The same Wilson who had told him, on their first flight together, that he would never be a real captain. The same Wilson who had spent years pretending that men like Miles didn't exist. And now, here he was. Watching. Waiting. Like all the others. Reynolds gestured to the seat across from him. Miles. He said smoothly. Please. Miles sat. Whitman leaned back in his chair. We have a situation. Miles tilted his head. Do we? Reynolds folded his hands. The rerouting to Denver. It caused delays. Disruptions. Passengers filed complaints. Executives have questions. Miles kept his face blank. Then they should ask the mechanics. He said, since the plane was malfunctioning. A pause. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. Look, Carter, we're all on the same team here. Miles smiled. The kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. Are we? Reynolds hesitated. No one's saying you did anything wrong. Another lie. That's good to hear, Miles said. Because I didn't. Whitman leaned forward. The point is, Carter, we need captains who can be relied on. There it was. Not skilled. Not capable. Relied on. The careful way power dressed itself up in professionalism. They weren't questioning his abilities. They were questioning his attitude. His cooperation. His place. Miles let the silence stretch before he spoke. I did my job, he said. I followed protocol. I put safety first. What exactly is the problem? Reynolds exhaled, tapping his fingers on the table. The problem is perception. And that was it, wasn't it? The truth, slipping out between carefully chosen words. The problem wasn't what Miles had done. The problem was that he had done it while being who he was. The problem was that a black captain had refused to play their game. The problem was that Miles Carter had reminded them that their power had limits. He sat back, folded his arms. I see. Reynolds leaned forward. This doesn't have to be a fight, Miles. It was a plea, a warning, a chance to step back, to bow out gracefully, to play along. And maybe, a long time ago, Miles would have. But he had learned something in this job. A thing no one had ever said out loud. But that he understood deep in his bones. They were never going to let him be captain on their terms. Because the moment he succeeded, the moment he sat in that left seat without question, without doubt, he would force them to admit that the world had changed. And men like Whitman, men like Reynolds, weren't ready for that. Miles stood. Anything else? Reynolds signed. Whitman looked like he had swallowed something sour. Wilson, silent the whole time, just watched, studying him, like he was trying to understand something he had never seen before. Finally, Reynolds said, no. Miles nodded once. Then he turned and walked out. The silence followed him back down to the terminal. But something had shifted. Because now, they weren't just watching him. They were waiting for him to fail. And that meant one thing. He was winning. Because men like Whitman, men like Reynolds, they only played defense when they were afraid. The thing about power is that it doesn't vanish. It shifts. It adapts. It learns how to disguise itself in new forms. New policies. New smiles that carry the same old knife. Miles Carter had learned this early. And now, standing in the Horizon Air Pilot's lounge, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into his bones, he knew one thing for certain. They weren't done with him yet. But then again, neither was he. The meeting with the executives had been a warning. Nothing more. A test. To see if he would break. If he would fold under the weight of unspoken threats. Instead, he had walked out of that glass-walled room untouched. And they had noticed. Because the next morning, an email landed in his inbox. A reassignment. Not a demotion. No, that would have been too obvious. Too easy to challenge. But a shift. Away from the high-profile routes. Away from the international flights. Back to the short-haul runs. The flights that didn't matter. A subtle way of saying, you don't belong at the top. Miles stared at the email for a long moment. Then he smiled. Because they had just given him exactly what he needed. The flight to Houston was uneventful. Until it wasn't. Midway through, as they cruised over Louisiana, the warning light blinked on. Fuel valve issue. Miles stiffened, checked the system. Nothing critical, but not something to ignore. Sinclair, his first officer, frowned. Want me to report it? Miles nodded. Do it. Sinclair hesitated. You know what this means, right? Miles did. Another report. Another delay. Another reason for the executives to call him in and say, "Why does this keep happening on your flights, Carter?" But Miles didn't flinch. Because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about the game they were playing. And he was about to flip the board. The plane landed safely in Houston. By the time they reached the gate, a maintenance crew was already waiting. Miles stepped out of the cockpit, watching as the mechanics ran their checks. Then he saw her. Lauren Kim, a flight attendant he had worked with years ago. Sharp, professional, and, more importantly, a woman who saw the things no one else was willing to name. She walked up to him, arms crossed. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" Miles smirked. "Aren't I always?" She didn't laugh. Instead, she glanced toward the mechanics, lowering her voice. "Look, I don't know the full story, but I've been hearing things." Miles studied her. "What things?" Lauren exhaled. "Something's happening up there," she said, nodding toward the executive offices. "Pilots getting shuffled, maintenance reports being lost. And the people who speak up?" She shook her head. "They don't last long." Miles clenched his jaw. He had known. But hearing it confirmed? That was different. Lauren looked at him, searching his face. "You're planning something, aren't you?" Miles smiled. "I'm just flying my assigned routes." She stared at him. Then, after a long pause, "Good luck with that." And she walked away. Later that night, as Miles sat in his hotel room, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "They're watching. Be careful." Miles didn't have to guess who had sent it. Didn't have to wonder what it meant. Because the moment he had chosen to fight, the moment he had refused to step aside, he had known this was coming. 2 days later, the news broke. A report leaked to the press. Horizon Air under investigation for safety violations. The FAA was involved. Lawyers were circling. And just like that, the men who had spent their careers building walls were now scrambling to keep them from falling. Miles sat in the pilot's lounge, watching the news play on the screen above. Sinclair sat beside him, shaking his head. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" Miles took a slow sip of his coffee. Sinclair laughed under his breath. "Jesus, Carter." But Miles didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. They had built a system meant to keep men like him out. And now, that system was crumbling. Not because he had fought harder than they expected, but because he had fought smarter. Because he had refused to play their game. Because he had remembered something they had all forgotten. The sky was never theirs. It belonged to those who dared to take it. And Miles Carter? He was just getting started.